He looked me up and down. This man who I had never once seen remove his jacket inside a conference room, this man who wore gold cufflinks at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and said with the voice of someone dismissing a cab, "Pack your things. You're just an employee. You always were." I smiled, I picked up my mug from the desk, and I left. My hands didn't shake, not this time. Because Richard Hartwell didn't know what I knew. Didn't know that 3 days earlier, in a quiet notary's office in Midtown, I had signed documents that no one on that board expected to exist. Didn't know that Mr. Gerald, the CEO he had just buried, the man he called his partner while dismissing his choices in life, had planned that moment 12 years in advance. Didn't know that Monday was going to be a lot more interesting than he imagined. Because I was just an employee, and that company had just become mine. Have you ever been let go from a place that was more yours than theirs? Tell me in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, because this story is for everyone who knows what it costs to build in silence and wait for the right moment to step forward. But let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who this man was, who I was, and what happened in those 12 years inside that company, to understand the weight of what took place the following Monday. My name is Miriam Okafor. I was born in Port Arthur, Texas, the youngest of 4 children, in a house 3 blocks from the refinery where my father worked the overnight shift for 22 years. My mother cleaned rooms at a Holiday Inn off the highway until her knees gave out, and then she sat at the front desk instead, because the manager knew better than to let her go. I grew up understanding the price of things, not because my parents lectured me about budgets, but because the reality of it was woven into every grocery trip, every school supply list, every birthday where my mother found a way to make something out of nothing. I was 19 when I drove myself to Houston in a 2003 Civic with 200,000 miles on it and a list of contacts my high school guidance counselor had given me. I worked as a server at a chain restaurant in the Galleria area for 8 months, then as a front desk coordinator at a dental office in Pearland, where I learned that being organized is a form of respect for yourself and for whoever is depending on you. Then I landed a job as an administrative assistant at a beverage distributor in Northwest Houston, where I taught myself Excel from scratch using YouTube tutorials during lunch breaks in the parking lot, eating from a Tupperware container my mother had packed for me. I didn't have money for classes, but I had something that no class was going to give me, the kind of hunger that doesn't come from an empty stomach but from knowing you're capable of more than what you're being allowed to do. At that distributor, the macro system someone had built years earlier was about to collapse because the person who created it left without documenting anything. Everyone complained. I figured it out. I rebuilt the documentation from scratch. Nobody asked me to. I did it because the problem was sitting there and I could solve it. That was the first time I understood that the difference between someone who serves and someone who leads isn't the title. It's who sees the problem before someone calls them to fix it. It was at that distributor that a client came in one afternoon. A man in his early 60s, salt and pepper hair, frameless glasses, the kind of easy confidence that comes from decades of making decisions, and asked me why someone who understood logistics spreadsheets the way I did was working as an admin assistant. I told him I was waiting for the right opportunity. He handed me a card and said, "Call Monday." That man was Gerald Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore and Hartwell Capital Partners. I called Monday. The firm was in a glass tower in the Galleria district. Marble lobby, suited receptionist, the kind of building that makes you stand up a little straighter when you walk in. I drove from my apartment in Sunnyside, wearing the only blazer I owned, with a printed resume from the FedEx office on Westheimer because I thought it looked more serious than an email. Mr. Gerald received me himself. No assistant, no 45-minute wait to establish hierarchy. He came to the lobby, shook my hand firmly and said, "Let's talk." The conversation lasted an hour and 40 minutes. He asked me about vendor management, about margins, about what I would have done differently at the distributor if I'd had authority. I answered everything, with data I had memorized, with analyses I had run on my own time simply because I found them interesting, never imagining anyone would actually ask me about them. When he described a hypothetical contract renegotiation scenario, I asked for paper and a pen, did 3 calculations and said, "In that case, the viable margin would be here. But if you want to extend the payment window, you'd need to compensate here." He looked at me for about 5 seconds with an expression I didn't know how to read yet, but eventually learned meant genuine curiosity. At the end, he said, "You have a sharp eye for numbers and good instincts for people. I need both of those at my table every day." My starting salary was $54,000 a year, with a contract, with health insurance, with a retirement match. I cried in the bathroom before I left the building, from gratitude, from relief, from something I didn't have a name for yet, but understand now: dignity, the feeling of being seen whole. In the first months, I was a junior executive assistant, scheduled meetings, managed the calendar, prepared presentations. But Mr. Gerald was the kind of leader who explained the reasoning behind things. When he asked me to prepare a fundraising report, he told me what he was going to do with that report, what decision he needed to make, which variable mattered most, what the risk was in each scenario. I was invisible in meetings, sat in a corner, took notes, didn't speak, but I processed everything, and he knew that. By year 2, I was a senior assistant. By year 4, I understood the firm's cash flow better than some of the directors. By year 6, I was the one who prepared the documents he brought to the board. By year 10, when he had a question about a contract or a provision in the partnership agreement, he called me before he called the attorney, not because I replaced the attorney, but because he knew I had already read the document and would point him to the exact line where the issue was. And during those 12 years, I watched that company from a position no one else had. I saw what happened before meetings. I saw what happened after. I saw the emails Mr. Gerald answered at 11 at night, and the ones he deliberately left for the morning. I saw who he had lunch with, and who he never scheduled. I saw the moments he came out of the conference room with his shoulders low because a decision had passed by 2 votes instead of the 4 he needed. And I saw how he treated Richard Hartwell. Richard was Mr. Gerald's brother-in-law, married to his sister Catherine since the early 90s. He was a founding partner on paper, but the firm had been built by the 2 of them in very different ways. Mr. Gerald built it with work, with vision, with the kind of judgment that made clients come back. Richard built it with seed capital from Catherine's family, which he never let anyone forget, and with a genuine talent for appearing in photographs at events and delivering speeches about a legacy that was mostly someone else's. The first time I heard Richard speak about me was in the hallway, when he was leaving a meeting with 2 directors and didn't realize I was there, standing near the kitchen with a stack of documents waiting to be filed. He said, without looking in my direction, to the head of finance, "Gerald has a thing for hiring people from nowhere." The director said something low I couldn't fully hear. Richard continued, "Capable, certainly, but capable in function. Let's not confuse the 2. I heard it. I kept filing. And I stored it with the clarity of someone who had learned that what people say when they think you aren't listening is the most honest thing they'll ever tell you. For years, the pattern repeated itself. Richard called employees by their titles, not their names. The receptionist was reception. The intern was the intern. I was Gerald's assistant, never just Miriam, never Miriam Okafor, as if my name were irrelevant information that the job title already replaced efficiently enough. When he needed something from me, which was rare because he preferred to ignore my existence when he could, he used a tone that floated between condescension and indifference, the way someone speaks to an automated system. Never aggressive, never explicitly disrespectful, just completely disconnected from any recognition that I was a person with a name, a story, a trajectory. With the rest of the administrative staff, it was more visible still. I could see it because I was the one who managed the schedules, who moved between every floor, who knew every employee's name from 12 to 2. Denise, at the front desk, told me once, during an afternoon when we were both waiting for a printer to unjam, that Richard had walked past her one morning and asked where the other one was. She had said, "Which one, Mr. Hartwell?" He had replied impatiently, "The one at the front with the braids." There were 3 receptionists. 2 wore braids regularly. Neither of them knew if it was about them. Denise told me this smiling, because she had learned to smile about these things. But I saw the exhaustion underneath the smile. The exhaustion of someone who spends the day being perceived as a function rather than a person. The person who helped me understand the pattern most clearly was Sandra Osei. Sandra was 56 years old, with close-cropped natural hair and a way of being in the world that mixed weariness and precision in proportions you only find in people who have survived more than one storm without losing their bearings. She had worked with Mr. Gerald for 8 years, as his executive secretary before I was hired. She was let go in a poorly handled restructuring while I was still in my first years at the firm. She came back 2 years before my conversation with Mr. Gerald about the will as an administrative consultant, because he had recognized that losing her was a mistake. Sandra and I became close the way closeness builds slowly, not fast, not declared. The kind of closeness that forms in small exchanges of expression during meetings. Did you notice that too? Said in the hallway after everyone else has gone. Over time, we had a standing Tuesday coffee, which we called calendar review, but which was really 30 minutes at the small table near the kitchen with 2 mugs and a conversation neither of us could have with anyone else in that building. It was during one of those Tuesdays that Sandra told me about the terminations during Richard's interim management. In 2018, she said, with the voice of someone telling something that has been held too long, when Mr. Gerald was out for that back procedure and Richard ran the firm for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Miriam, that's all it was. He terminated 4 people, without process, without documented cause. 3 were women, 2 were black. Did Mr. Gerald know? I asked. Gerald came back and found the situation done. He put a formal objection on record in the partnership minutes. He offered supplementary settlements to the terminated employees out of his own pocket, without formal documentation, because he wanted to do right by them without creating a conflict that exposed the firm further. Sandra paused. That was his way. Try to repair without making war. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And Richard? Richard said he had made necessary difficult decisions. Used exactly those words. Like he had demonstrated courage. She set her mug down with more force than the gesture required. It wasn't courage. It was opportunity. A man who used 6 weeks of authority to do what he couldn't do with Gerald present. Sandra had kept documents from that period. Not by plan, she said that clearly, but by instinct, the instinct of someone who had learned over decades in corporate environments that paper doesn't lie, and memory does. She had the termination communications, the partnership minutes that existed, and the ones that should have existed but didn't, and a formal objection memo Mr. Gerald had sent Richard about the terminations that Richard had never formally acknowledged. When Mr. Gerald told me about the will in September and I spent the following 3 weeks thinking before I answered, one of the things I kept coming back to was the conversation with Sandra, the conviction that what Richard had done in 6 weeks was a rehearsal, and that without Mr. Gerald in the way, the rehearsal would become the permanent performance. That was part of what made me say yes. It was a Thursday morning in August when everything began to shift. I was at my desk when Sandra found me. Not a call this time, she came to me directly, and her face told me before her words did. Mr. Gerald had collapsed at home. He was at Memorial Hermann. I didn't go as an employee fulfilling protocol. I went because Mr. Gerald was the person who had changed the direction of my life, and I needed to be there. He didn't make it. He passed at 10:47 in the morning. In the hallway outside the ICU, his sister Catherine, Richard's wife, held me for a moment without saying anything. When she stepped back, her eyes were swollen and her hands wouldn't stay still. She said quietly, "He talked about you a lot, you know, especially these last few months." I told her he was the most extraordinary person I had had the privilege of working alongside. She nodded. Then she said, almost to herself, "He was worried about the firm, about what came after." I said I understood. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read in that moment, then said, "Take care of yourself, Miriam," and went back to the family at the end of the hall. The service was 4 days later, a private gathering at a chapel in River Oaks, family and close colleagues only. I went. I stood in the back, in black, spoke quietly to a few people, mostly listened. When I filed past the casket, I stopped for a moment, and I thought about September of the previous year, when Mr. Gerald had called me into his office for a conversation I hadn't expected. "I have a heart condition," he had said, with the measured calm of someone who has already processed the news before sharing it. "Arrhythmia. Nothing requiring immediate intervention, but my cardiologist wants to monitor it closely. I've decided I need to get certain things in order." And then he told me about the decision he had made, about the will, about the partnership structure, about the 51%. "Why me?" I asked. He looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Because you understand this firm the way I understand it. You understand the numbers, you understand the people, you understand what's at stake, and because in 12 years you have never, Not once done anything for the title. You've done it for the work. That's rare. Rarer than I can properly tell you. I told him he was asking something enormous of me. I know. You can say no. I can leave it to a trust, to a management structure. But I don't know anyone better suited for this than you. I stayed quiet for a long time. I looked at my hands. I thought about the girl who drove from Port Arthur to Houston in a Civic with 200,000 miles on it. I thought about 12 years of sitting in corners of conference rooms, taking notes on what others would present. I thought about the hallway where Richard said, capable, certainly, in the tone of someone who has already decided the ceiling of what you can be. Then I said, give me a month to think about it. He gave me 3 weeks, and I said yes. 2 weeks after the funeral, the board convened in special session. I was called to attend as executive assistant, for documentation, for minutes, my usual role. Richard chaired the meeting, He spoke about Mr. Gerald's legacy with the rehearsed gravity of someone who has been preparing that speech for years. He talked about the future of the firm, about necessary transition, about continuity. He used we constantly. We who built this. We who will carry this forward. We who understand what Gerald would have wanted, without ever specifying who we was, but making clear by the way he avoided eye contact with anyone below partner level that I was not included. At the end of the meeting, he asked me to stay. When the others had filed out, Richard stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward me with the particular gait of someone accustomed to entering rooms without being invited. Miriam, he said, I need you to understand that with Gerald's absence, the operational structure of the firm is going to change. We'll be bringing in an interim CEO, we'll restructure the senior team, and naturally we'll be reviewing positions that were tied directly to Gerald's office. I understand, I said. You've done excellent work over these 12 years, he continued with the porcelain smile. But you know how these things go. An executive assistant position is tied to the executive. Without the executive, the role loses its purpose. A calculated pause. We'll offer you a fair severance. I'll need a few days to organize the transition of documents and pending items, I said. Of course. You have until Friday. I went back to my desk, turned off my monitor, and sat looking at my keyboard for about 3 minutes. Not because I was in shock, but because I was choosing the right moment to move. And the right moment wasn't then. On Friday, Richard staged my exit with the care of someone who believes symbolic gestures are power. He could have called me into his office, with only HR present, for the standard severance protocol. It would have been private, professional, appropriate. He didn't do that. At 10 in the morning, when the floor had maximum foot traffic, when people were moving between rooms, interns were carrying paper through the halls, the 11 o'clock meetings hadn't started yet, and the open area was full, Richard walked out of the glass-walled office he had been occupying informally since Mr. Gerald's death, flanked by 2 board members, and came toward my desk. I saw him coming. I didn't pretend otherwise. He stopped about 10 feet from me in the open walkway, where the sight line was clear to at least 15 desks. He took off his glasses, put his hands in his pockets, and said, at a volume precisely calibrated to be heard without appearing to project, Miriam, we're closing out your employment today. As discussed, you've been an excellent assistant to Gerald. We hope you find a new position that's a good fit for your skills. There was a beat where the space went quieter, not silent. People were still moving, keyboards still clicking. But the specific kind of quiet that settles when a room full of people decides simultaneously to pay attention without using their bodies. Patricia from legal stepped forward with the envelope. I took the envelope. I took my mug, the ceramic mug my mother had given me when I reached my 10th year at the firm, with a little painted cardinal on the side because she knew it was my favorite bird. I put my mother's photo in my bag. The small potted plant from the windowsill went into the cardboard box I'd brought that morning, knowing I would need it. I shook Patricia's hand. I did not shake Richard's. I turned toward the rest of the floor, box in my arms, and found several pairs of eyes that were trying not to be found. Denise, at reception, had her jaw tight in the way I recognized, contained anger. The anger of someone watching an injustice they have no power to address out loud. Sandra had stepped into the side hallway but told me later she stood there and listened. 2 interns looked at the floor at exactly the same moment. I said, to no one in particular and everyone at once, "Keep doing great work, everyone." Then I turned to Richard. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. Good luck." I smiled, and I left, because Monday was going to be interesting. On Saturday, Mr. Gerald's attorney, Douglas Hale, of Hale and Reeves in the Galleria, formally notified the board of Whitmore and Hartwell Capital Partners of a special meeting Monday at 10 a.m. for reading, presentation, and registration of a partnership interest transfer instrument per the testamentary disposition of deceased founding partner Gerald Whitmore. The notification arrived at 7:19 Saturday evening. I know the exact time because I was in the kitchen of my apartment in Sunnyside making rice when my phone lit up with the confirmation from the firm. I read the message, set the phone on the counter, stirred the rice, breathed. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, as always. "Baby, I was just thinking about you." "Hi, Mama. How are you?" "Good. Your Aunt Renee came by with tomatoes from her garden. Made the best sauce tonight." A pause. "What about you? How's everything with your job? You didn't say much when you called Wednesday." I had told her about Mr. Gerald's death. I hadn't told her about the will, but standing there in my kitchen on a Saturday night, with the message still open on my phone, with the rice going on the stove, with the apartment quiet around me, I decided she could know. I told her everything. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Miriam, are you telling me that on Monday you're going to be the owner of a company?" "Part owner," I said. "Majority partner, but you're the one who decides?" "Yes." Another silence. Then, in the voice I have known my whole life, the voice she uses when she is trying not to cry, she said, "You always found a way through, baby. Since you were small, you always saw the opening when everybody else was still looking at the wall." I swallowed. "You taught me that." "No, I didn't," she said, and I could hear the smile. "That came from inside you. I just bought the car." The Monday meeting was at 10 a.m. I arrived at 9:50, black suit, white blouse, hair back. I walked in through the same marble lobby where I had walked 12 years earlier with a printed resume from a FedEx office on Westheimer. The receptionist, Denise, 24 years old, 8 months with the firm, who I had helped learn the scheduling system when she started, looked at me with the expression of someone who doesn't quite understand what's happening but can feel that it's significant. "Good morning, Miriam. You can go up. They said you were coming." I said, "Thank you, Denise." The conference room on the 12th floor had a table for 20. Richard was seated at the head, not the seat he usually used, but Mr. Gerald's seat, the place that had been empty since August. I noticed when I walked in and said nothing. Around the table, board member Carl Whitfield, 2 other board members, 2 senior directors, Patricia from legal, and 2 outside attorneys I knew from documents but had never dealt with directly. When I walked in, there was a beat of silence. Everyone knew me. No one knew why I was there. Richard raised his eyebrows with the precision of someone who rehearses expressions. "Miriam, I wasn't expecting you today. Your separation was finalized Friday." From across the table, Douglas Hale rose slowly. "Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to open this meeting with the presentation of the documents that warranted this convening." Richard frowned. "Mr. Hale, with all due respect, I'd like to understand the protocol here. What is the connection between this meeting and Gerald's former assistant?" "That will be clear within the next few minutes," Hale said. He opened his briefcase. He removed a bound copy of a document and placed it on the table with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. He began to read, not rushing, not performing, simply reading with the clarity of someone who respects the weight of what the words carry. The deceased founding partner, Gerald Allen Whitmore, in a will executed before a notary in October of last year, before 2 witnesses and in full legal capacity, as certified by a physician's assessment attached to the instrument, directed the transfer of 51% of his partnership interest in Whitmore and Hartwell Capital Partners to Miriam Adaze Okafor, Social Security number on file. He cited my information. His senior executive assistant, with an uninterrupted employment relationship of 12 years. The silence that dropped in that room had physical weight. I felt it settle over every person at the table. I watched the moment the words reached Richard, watched the color leave his face, not all at once, but in stages, the way water recedes. "This is," he started, "legally valid, registered, and uncontestable in its terms," Hale said, without raising his voice. "The instrument was executed in compliance with Texas Estates Code, and the transfer of partnership interest falls within the parameters of the firm's partnership agreement." Richard put his palms flat on the table. "Gerald was ill. He was not in a position to—" "The physician's assessment from September," Hale said, placing a copy in front of Richard, "certifies full legal capacity. No cognitive or emotional impairment. The will was executed 1 month after that assessment. Richard looked at the document. He did not pick it up. Board member Carl Whitfield leaned forward slightly. Richard, I worked alongside Gerald for 15 years. So did you. Neither of us ever needed someone to make a decision for him. This letter, he touched the envelope in front of him, reads exactly like him. Precise, direct, explains every choice with the reasoning behind it. You know his voice. I know his voice, Richard said. What I'm questioning is his emotional state. What is the evidence of compromised emotional state? Asked board member Nadine Graves. She had been silent until that moment. Her letter read and carefully folded in front of her. Not rhetoric, evidence. Richard had no answer. In August, I said, Mr. Gerald led the investor conference in Denver. In September, he approved by unanimous vote the $46 million acquisition of the Meridian portfolio. In October, he executed the will. In November, he ran the annual planning session for 2025. I organized every one of those schedules. I was present at every one of those meetings. I paused. Which part of that suggests incapacity? Richard walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, the posture of someone who needs 2 seconds to recalibrate without being watched. Then he turned. You spent 12 years being paid to serve, he said. And this time the porcelain mask was completely gone. No more calibrated executive voice, no more composed expression, just what was underneath, the bare conviction that certain places belong to certain people and that the rest of the world exists to sustain that arrangement. That is what you are. It's what you'll still be when this is over. I let the sentence land in the room. I let every person present hear it fully. Then I said quietly, without raising my voice, you just said, in front of an attorney and 3 board members, that your grounds for contesting Gerald's decision is that I worked, that I served, that I was paid for it. I tilted my head slightly. I want that on the record, because when your case reaches a judge, that argument will say a great deal more about you than about me. Patricia from legal was typing, not looking up, doing her job. That's not what Richard started. That is exactly what you said, Nadine said, with a calm that was firmer than any show of force. And it was heard. Richard walked to the conference room door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. He turned. This isn't over. That's your prerogative, I said. But while any proceedings run, if you choose to pursue them, I hold 51% of the partnership interest and a partnership agreement that authorizes me to act, and I intend to act immediately. You will destroy what we built. No, I said. I'm going to protect what Gerald built, which is different from what you built, or what you were planning to build. He left. The door closed with a firmness that wasn't quite a slam, but made sure you knew it had happened. The room was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then Whitfield took off his glasses, rubbed his face, and said, All right, let's talk about next steps. Nadine looked at me with an expression I couldn't name in the moment but recognized later, the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment they had made with insufficient information. Do you have a plan? She asked. Yes, I said. Would you like to hear it? She opened her hands on the table. Go ahead. In the weeks that followed, what Douglas had predicted came to pass. Richard retained a litigation firm and filed a petition to contest the will, alleging undue influence and diminished capacity of the testator. The initial filing was aggressive. It referenced a power imbalance that created conditions for implicit coercion, cited the employment relationship as structurally compromising. It was well-drafted, expensive, and legally weak, because Mr. Gerald had executed the will in October. In August of that same year, he was leading the investor conference in Denver. In September, he was approving a $46 million acquisition. The physician's assessment was unequivocal. While the proceedings ran, Richard also worked another front. He used his network in Houston's business community, a significant network, built over 30 years of events and memberships and deal-making, to circulate a parallel narrative, not about the legal matter itself, because the matter was public record and the facts were what they were, but about me, about what I was, about what I represented. I heard from 2 separate sources, a former director who called me personally, and Whitfield who flagged it discreetly, that Richard was describing the situation at industry events as a legal absurdity and a manipulation that will be resolved. That he consistently referred to me as Gerald's former assistant, with calculated emphasis on former and assistant, as if those two words together were a sufficient summary of everything I was or could ever be. I found out on a Tuesday morning, in the temporary office I had set up, not Mr. Gerald's office yet because I wasn't ready for that, but a small conference room where I'd been working. Sandra came to me directly, face tight. "He's talking at the club, publicly." "I know," I said. "And you're not going to do something?" I looked at her. "Let him talk. Every public statement he makes is going to become evidence in his own proceeding that he's acting from personal interest. Douglas already knows. We're documenting." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a small smile, "Gerald knew exactly what he was doing." "He did," I said. 2 months into the proceedings, someone I hadn't expected made contact. His name was Marcus Webb, 51 years old, former chief operating officer at Whitmore and Hartwell, terminated 16 months earlier in a separation that Mr. Gerald had described to me at the time as a battle I lost inside the board. Marcus had left with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement, standard, but he had left bitter, and he had kept things. He found me through email, requested a discreet meeting, said he had documentation about a specific period, 2018 through 2020, during which board decisions had redirected operational resources toward contracts with firms related to board members themselves, without proper disclosure to the other partners. Mr. Gerald had grown suspicious. He had commissioned an internal audit. The audit had been blocked by Richard. Marcus had the emails. We met at a coffee shop in the village on a Thursday afternoon. He arrived with a folder and the expression of someone who has spent 16 months deciding whether to do this. "Why now?" I asked. He set the folder on the table. "Because when I left, I believed it wouldn't matter, that he'd continue, that this was how things worked." He looked at me directly. "But now there's someone with the authority to do something about it, and I'd rather that person be you." "This will expose me," I said. "It will expose him," Marcus said. "You'll be the person who received the information and directed it to the appropriate authorities. I'll be the witness. My attorney has reviewed the NDA. This isn't covered by the clause." I looked at the folder. I thought about Mr. Gerald, about the audit was blocked, about 2018 when I had noticed a discrepancy in a certain quarter's reports and asked him about it. And he had said, with a brevity that wasn't like him, "Leave it alone, Miriam. This isn't the moment. It was the moment now. Give me 2 days to consult with Douglas," I said. Marcus nodded. 2 days. Douglas reviewed the documents in a full afternoon. He called me the following day. "This is real. It's serious. And it's going to create significantly more difficulty for Richard's legal position than he's currently accounting for. We submitted everything to the relevant regulatory authorities, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Texas State Securities Board, not because I wanted to destroy Richard. I could say that, and it would be partly true. I did it because it was right, because the other partners had been harmed, because the firm had been harmed, and because Mr. Gerald had tried to stop it and had been and I was now the person with the authority to continue what he had started. The will contest was dismissed by the court 9 months later. The ruling was clear, full legal capacity established, no evidence of undue influence, instrument executed in compliance with all applicable requirements. Richard did not appeal. I heard from Whitfield, weeks later, that Richard had consulted another firm about appellate options, and that the attorneys themselves had advised against pursuing it further. The odds were poor, and the parallel regulatory inquiry had begun generating discomfort in circles Richard frequented and needed. He withdrew. He resigned from the board. Not formally removed, he stepped down voluntarily before any vote could transform the exit into a documented defeat, a calculated withdrawal from someone still trying to control some portion of the narrative. I heard through others that he had pivoted to other projects, that the Whitmore and Hartwell name no longer came up in his conversations, that his standing in certain corners of Houston's business community had been affected, not catastrophically, but enough that certain dinners were no longer on the calendar, and certain events no longer had that particular confident presence he had cultivated for 30 years. I didn't look for more than that. I had something else to focus on. In the first 18 months as majority partner, I didn't change everything at once. I changed what needed changing, and let what was working keep working. The first hire I proposed to the board was Deborah Park as CEO, an executive I had been watching from a distance for years, who had a track record of operational restructuring in mid-market firms, and who, when I reached out to her, asked questions before asking about compensation. That told me what I needed to know. Deborah and I were different. She moved faster on operational decisions. I was more methodical with long-range analysis. In the first months, we had friction, meetings that ended without resolution, moments where both of us had to yield. But we learned to work together in a way that made the firm stronger than either of us would have been alone. The first agenda item I brought to the board that wasn't about governance was a full review of the firm's personnel practices. There were independent contractor agreements where there should have been employment. Workers performing continuous service with defined hours under direct supervision, classified as consultants, to reduce payroll obligations. I knew this because I had organized those contracts myself. There was outsourcing in core functions that cut costs at the expense of the people performing the work. There was compensatory time that accumulated and was never honored. I put all of it on the agenda. I heard objections about cost, about margins, about how things have always been done. I listened to every objection. I asked the right questions. And then I said, approved. And it was. Costs went up the first 2 quarters. Margins tightened. Some directors came to me with the measured tone of people who believe speaking quietly makes an argument more reasonable. I listened, and I held the decision. By the second half of the fiscal year, the operational result was the best in 4 years. Not because the wider margins had returned, but because a team working with proper classification, with recognized hours, with legal protections in place, produced more, stayed longer, cost less in the long run than the constant turnover the old practices had generated. Whitfield called when the numbers came out. Gerald would have loved seeing this. He would, I said. On a Tuesday, about 8 months after the board restructuring, I was sitting in the office that had been Mr. Gerald's. I had finally moved in, not in a hurry, but because it was the right office for what I was doing. I kept the mahogany desk, the bookshelf with his books. I replaced only the personal photographs with something of my own, a framed print my mother had given me when I drove to Houston, a watercolor of a cardinal on a branch that she'd found at a church sale and wrapped in newspaper and tucked into my bag the morning I left Port Arthur. It had been leaning against walls in apartments for 10 years because I never had quite the right place for it. I was looking at the cardinal when Deborah walked in with a coffee and a folder. She placed the folder on the desk and said, "Third quarter results, best since 2020. I picked up the folder. I opened it. I looked at the numbers I knew by memory, and which now had a different signature at the bottom. Mine. Gerald would have liked this, I said. Deborah smiled. Yeah, he would have. She looked at the cardinal print. That's pretty. Where's it from? Port Arthur, Texas, I said. Where I grew up. She nodded. It's right for this wall. It is, I said. It is. And if you're listening to this now, and you recognize something in it, if you have ever been the invisible one in some room, if you've been the person sitting in the corner taking notes on what others would present, if someone has used the title you didn't hold as evidence that you didn't understand, that you didn't deserve, that you wouldn't arrive, then I want to say something to you directly. Mr. Gerald chose me, but what he chose existed before he appeared. It existed in the girl teaching herself Excel in a parking lot in Northwest Houston. It existed in the receptionist who smiled with her eyes when the patient came in angry. It existed in the $2,000 my mother saved from change without telling me, because she knew I was going to need a way out and she wanted me to have one. No generous employer creates what you're worth. What a generous employer can do, when one exists, is see what was already there. And that brings me to what I want to say about rights. Because what I learned inside that firm, and what I changed when I had the power to change it, wasn't only about me. It was about the structure. Every person who works, in any capacity, has a right to honest recognition of the employment relationship that actually exists. Not the relationship that's convenient for the employer to name, not the contract structured to minimize obligation at the expense of the person performing the work. The actual relationship, with the protections that flow from it. There are people working today as independent contractors or freelancers or project consultants, titles employers choose with care, when in fact they perform continuous service, on defined schedules, under direct supervision and control, under federal law, and in most states, that is employment. And employment generates legal protections that no contract with another name can strip away. The Fair Labor Standards Act establishes minimum standards that apply regardless of how an employer labels the arrangement. The Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division investigates misclassification. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission handles workplace discrimination claims, and in states like California, the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights and Protections under organizations like the National Domestic Workers Alliance have extended explicit recognition to workers who have historically been excluded from these frameworks. If you're in a situation where you believe your work relationship is being misclassified, or where you've experienced wage theft, harassment, or discrimination, you have options. You can contact your state's Department of Labor. You can reach out to the EEOC. You can find free or low-cost legal assistance through your local legal aid office, through worker centers in your area, or through organizations that specifically support domestic and service workers. Document everything: messages, schedules, tasks performed, who directed your work. Documentation is what transforms an account into evidence. And if someone is using economic power to make you feel replaceable, understand that replaceable is not the same as without value. It's what someone who doesn't want to pay you what you're worth will call you, so they don't have to recognize you. Mr. Gerald told me once that the best hire he had ever made was in the parking lot of a beverage distributor in Northwest Houston, because he stopped looking at the title and looked at the person. Not every employer does that, but you can look at yourself first. What you know, what you do, what you carry. That doesn't depend on someone seeing it to exist. It exists. And the day the right person appears, or the day you create your own opening, it will be there, whole, ready to be used. Thank you for being here until the end. Share this with someone you want to remind of their own worth, because there are so many people who spend their working lives being treated as the auxiliary to something they actually built, without knowing they could become its partner. Subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming. And tell me in the comments, have you ever worked somewhere that called you by your job title instead of your name, or treated you like a function instead of a person? What did that feel like? I want to know. Those stories matter more than they seem. Until next time.